Welcome to the Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the greatest minds in geopolitics and finance. My guest today is the professor of applied economics at Johns Hopkins University, Mr. Steve Hanke, a crowd favorite and always a rich discussion with this gentleman. Let's get right into it. Here is Mr. Steve Hanke. Enjoy.
This is Jay Martin.
All right, here I am with Professor Stephen Hanke. Steve, it's great to have you back on the program. I appreciate you making the time.
Great to be with you, Jay.
Well, let's start here. I just want to sort of crack you open. What are you most focused on right now from macro geopolitical standpoint? What's front and center getting your attention?
Well, what's always front and center is what's going on with the money supply. I think the most reliable model for national income determination is the quantity theory of money, which says in short, if you change the money supply very much one way or another, with a lag, it will end up working its way into the economy, and specifically the nominal GDP. And nominal GDP contains a real GDP growth number and an inflation number. So you add those two together and you get nominal GDP. But the determination of those is what has been going on with the money supply prior to the date at which you're looking at nominal GDP. Or looking at it the other way around, looking at the money supply today is going to tell you where nominal GDP is going to be in a year or two.
And so how do you think that information is being processed by Washington today? Because we're sort of at the critical point now with this big, beautiful bill. And it seems to me that subjects like money supply, deficits, debt, basic things in finance are making mainstream headlines. And I've not seen that much at all in my career in this business. But people seem more curious, or at least are being push that narrative more than they have in the past. Do you agree with that, Steve? What's your take?
Well, the money supply, you won't find it in the press at all.
Not yet. That's true. Yeah.
They talk about, when you get into the fiscal side of things, the big debate is, how much the deficit will be next year, or maybe going out 10 years or whatever your forecast period is. And what the debt level is going to be, and that's more or less the main thing at 30,000 feet. Now you get a lot of little stuff going on, like who's going to be subsidized more, who's going to be subsidized less, what welfare program is going to expand, which is going to contract, all that kind of stuff. You find a lot of that in the press, but the money supply. No, and the main reason for that is that the central bankers, including the governor of the Fed, Jerome Powell, they just dismiss it. They claim that changes in the money supply don't have any reliable connection with what's going on in the economy, not nominal GDP, which of course is just wrong, but that's their view. And that view is spawned in a way because for the last 30 years, the macroeconomic models that have been taught and developed are what's called post-Keynesian models of macroeconomics, and they don't include money as a variable. So that's one reason that they're out. The other is a more pragmatic political thing, and that is, if the central bankers can get money off the drawing boards and out of the public's eye, then if the money supply goes up, what's going to happen? We're going to have more inflation. And we have more inflation. People don't like that. And they don't want to, the central bankers don't want to be blamed for it. So remember the last inflation spurt that we had following the COVID pandemic, the central bankers were putting out this bum information that, it was transitory and it was because of supply chain disruptions, or it was because oil prices were going up or something like that. That was what was causing inflation. But in fact, what was causing inflation was the fact that money supply was exploding. I mean, in the United States, starting in February of 2020, it skyrocketed and peaked out at little over 18% year over year. That's the highest rate of growth we've ever had in money supply measured by M2 in the United States since the founding of the Fed. And of course, what happened? We got inflation. Inflation peaked out at 9.1%. And then the Fed did what? They started tightening up money supply, putting everything in reverse. And of course, the inflation's come down. It's down at 2.4% now and going lower. So by not paying attention to the money supply, they let it go up, they let it go down, and inflation goes up, inflation goes down, and we're on this kind of roller coaster ride.
How much, let me ask you a question. How much of that matters when it's in the context of what other countries are doing? So the US, I think, has increased the money supply by like 82% over the last decade. And you can look at almost every other country and find higher numbers, though. And so on its own, it looks like a really bad scenario and a very consequential one. And no doubt it is. Is that impact blunted to a degree by the fact that you'll see, Egypt in that same, Egypt's maybe a bad example, but nearly 700% during that same time period. And you'll find a laundry list of countries all surpassing their own money supply in the same duration, whether it's last year or last decade. And so how much of this is a relative game? And how would you answer that, Steve?
Well, this is an interesting question because the part of the hiding, in a way, the central bankers were hiding when the inflation went up in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Europe, for example. They said, well, it's international. It's international. No. Monetary policy and changes in the money supply and consequent changes in inflation, they're all local. They're not international. So why do you think the inflation's a lot higher in Egypt than it is in the United States? Because the rate of growth in the money supply is a lot faster. Why do you think China, which is, forget Egypt, China's the second biggest economy in the world, or depending on how you measure it, actually can be number one. And they're in a deflation. Their inflation rate has been negative for the last 4 months in a row. So they're in a deflation. And the reason for that is very clear. Their target for inflation is now 2%. They just changed it at the end of last year. So now their inflation target's 2%. And the rate of growth in the money supply, Hanke's golden growth rate that's consistent with hitting that 2% target, would be about 10%. And since early 2023, the money supply has been growing year over year at a lower rate than that. And now it's growing at 7.9%. So that's why they're way below the inflation target at 2%. And in fact, they're deflating right now. And they have a real problem because, of course, this leads in, if you look at the manufacturing sector for the last 4 months, also in China, manufacturing activity has been declining. So they're in a deflationary slump, and it's a real problem because even though the central bank, that part of the money supply that's supplied by the central bank is growing at a rate higher than the golden growth rate of 10%, the biggest factor in the money supply is always the commercial banks, because they produce most of the money. Commercial banks do. And that rate of growth in China has been quite a bit lower than the golden growth rate. And so that's why you have deflation. Now you say, well, why is the money supply growing so slowly? That portion of it that's being produced by the commercial banks. And it's basically because we had a big housing bubble in China. It popped. Everyone was over indebted. And now they're deleveraging. They're trying to reduce the level of debt that they have on their balance sheets. And when you do that, of course, the demand for loans is weak. And if the demands for loan are weak, the supply of loans that comes out, the quantity supplied is pretty weak and low, and the money supply doesn't grow very fast. So it's all about money, banking, monetary policy. That's what drives everything. But it's local. China's deflating, and our inflation in the United States is still even above our target of 2%. It's 2.4%.
I want to dive a bit deeper into China, but before, just maybe one last question on the sort of money supply not making headlines when a bunch of sort of periphery or adjacent subjects are. And, you mentioned, I think you said they tend to keep that hidden, right? The money supply numbers don't make mainstream headlines. And is that partially because there's no route other than increasing the money supply in front of us, right? We're looking at $3 to $4 trillion deficits per year, another $100 trillion in unfunded future liabilities, promises to pay, social credit hitting a wall. We're probably going to increase military spending, not decrease it. And the only path forward is increasing the money supply to the extent that we need to. But if people understood the relationship between that and inflation, they wouldn't be for it. And so it's hidden as a consequence. What do you think about that?
Well, what you say, it may or may not occur, because there are two ways to fund a deficit. You can either fund it with direct taxes, or the other way is you can have an inflation tax. There are two ways to eliminate a deficit, not to fund it, actually. I
Sure.
misspoke. So let's go through the scenario where you run a big deficit, and the central bank does not choose to monetize the deficit. Now, what that means is that we have a deficit, and we know it has to be financed. And to finance it, the government can sell the bonds to the non-bank public. And if they sell the bonds to the non-bank public, you buy the bonds, and you write a check for it. You receive a bond, and that asset is replaced by the asset that you had that you transferred to the government, which is your checking account. And that reduces the money supply. If you finance it that way, the money supply is going to be reduced. All things remaining equal, as they say, ceteris paribus, you'll end up reducing the money supply. Now, the other way around, and more typically what happens, especially in places, you mentioned Egypt, places like Egypt and developing countries, they run a deficit, and the Treasury sells bonds, but who do they sell the bonds to? They sell it to the central bank. The central bank monetizes the deficit. And in that case, the money supply is increased, and you have inflation. So it depends on how you finance it. The one thing we do know is once you get these deficits, are big, there's tremendous pressure on the central bank to finance part of it. And in developing countries, that's very typical. And it happened exactly in the pandemic in most of the big Western countries. The United States, over 90% of the huge deficit that exploded when the pandemic hit was financed by the Fed. That's why the money supply growth shot up to a record high on a year-over-year basis. The Fed was in there buying all these treasuries, and that's when you see language like, oh, the Fed's balance sheet's expanding, exploding. Why? It's because they're buying treasury bonds and bills. And when they do that, the money supply goes up.
So let's get back to China then. So I want to understand that deflationary scenario a bit better. Could you walk me through the the thesis there, Steve? What's at the roots, and what would your forecast, if you have a forecast for near term, what does that look like? I'd love to understand that better.
Well, the key thing is, what should the rate of growth in the money supply be measured by M2? We're using M2 here to be consistent with hitting a 2% inflation target. How fast would the money supply have to be growing? And that's about 10% per year. Right now it's growing at 7.9%. And it has been below 10% since early 2023. So we've had anemic growth rate in the money supply, and that feeds through with a lag to nominal GDP. And by the way, the nominal GDP target, they actually have a target in China, unlike most other places. The real growth component's 5%, and I already told you the inflation target's 2%. So the nominal GDP target's 7%. They're just not going to make it. That's the forecast, because for some time the money supply has been growing at less than Hanke's golden growth rate of 10%. And so we know going forward that things will be sluggish. Nominal GDP will be sluggish. And this deflationary situation that they're in will be hard to buck, by the way. And one reason for that is that the commercial banks are facing a situation where there's very light demand for credit, because after the housing bubble popped in China, all the firms that were over indebted want to reduce the level of debt that they have on their balance sheet. So they're trying to deleverage. So they're not going to the bank wanting to borrow more money in general. So they're in kind of a deflationary trap, as I see it. I don't think things are going to change very rapidly.
And in order for them to, so they're increasing their money supply at around 7.9%, sub the golden 10% rule since 2023. This slows GDP, and coupled with a decreased appetite for lending because of a recent real estate bubble popping, firms are looking to decrease their debt burden, not increase it right now. So the path out of that, could it be as simple as ramping up the expansion of the money supply to 10% or maybe 11% for a year or two to get growth accelerated again? Why is it so tough to correct? I mean, that's what you wrapped up with there. You said this is a very tough thing to turn around.
You have to realize that about 80% of the money supply is produced by commercial banks. So the government can produce. They have the capacity to goose things, and they are actually the state money produced by the People's Bank of China is actually growing at a little over the golden growth rate of 10%. I think it's growing at around 13%, as I recall.
Okay.
But the elephant in the room, it's commercial banks. So there are things that can be done to change the tenor of monetary policy and loosen it up, and that would be changes in bank regulations. For example, reserve requirements. They could reduce the reserve requirements, the amount of reserves that commercial banks hold, and that would give the commercial banks more capacity to loan. But then they're going to run into this same problem that I mentioned before, and that is all the firms in China, they're trying to deleverage and take on less debt. So we don't know how effective that reduction in reserve requirements would be.
Right. Even if the banks had more leniency to lend out more cash, the appetite's not there. So it might not matter. At present, it wouldn't matter at all.
Yeah, that's why I say I think it's going to be a slow boat to China, so to speak, because the deleveraging of the balance sheets has to actually happen and occur and slow down before the demand for loans starts coming up, and that would mean that the contribution of commercial banks to the growth in the money supply would pick up. So
Could
they're in
part
a
of that,
they're in kind of a tight corner in a way. And then,
yeah,
on top of that, by the way, most of this uh, you can find in the new book that Matt Sakurki and I wrote called Making Money Work. Wiley published that on May 6th and released it. That book is explaining in detail essentially everything we've been talking about so far, how the system actually works. And one big emphasis that we make in there is that most people, number one, don't look at quantity theory of money. We talked about that earlier, and part of the one point of the book is you better start looking at monetary policy, because that's money is the fuel that supplies energy to the engine. So that's point number one. Point number two is this focus on the commercial banks and the importance of commercial banks, and the fact that regulations that are imposed on commercial banks have a big impact on the lending that they do and the contribution that they make to the growth rate in the money supply. And since the great financial crisis of 2008, the commercial banks, through Basel capital asset ratios and reserve requirements and other bank regulation changes that came after the great financial crisis, have kind of strangled banks in a way. So the growth rate in loans and the contribution that the banks make to the money supply and the economy has been reduced since the great financial crisis. So we get into all of these things. So point number one, money supply and the quantity theory of money is very important and should be in the picture. And point number two is, if you're looking at the quantity of money, the elephant in the room are commercial banks. So they're the big contributor. Most people don't realize, Jay, they think central banks produce all the money, but that's not correct. Private commercial banks produce most of the money that's produced, not central banks.
by loaning it into existence.
Yes. So
Yeah.
so that,
So therefore, then
that,
it takes two to tango, as you mentioned, right? Commercial banks can have more leniency and flexibility to lend, but if no one's borrowing, those policies don't matter so much. In the case of China right now, until firms are able to deleverage a little bit, reduce their debt burden, their appetite for borrowing is not going to be there where it needs to be, where it was. Is there anything else, like, because I just wonder what else is triggering maybe like a lack of consumer confidence that would contribute to firms having more borrowing appetite? And could some of this be in response to trade aggressions between China and the United States? You mentioned manufacturing's down all throughout China, and that's because exports to their biggest customer are down as well, probably. But does that factor in, or are those things too
oh yes,
decoupled, Steve?
yeah,
What's your take?
that's a very important point. Confidence comes in because it does affect the demand for credit, the demand function. If you have a supply and demand diagram, in a quadrant up there, what happens if confidence collapses, the demand curve shifts to the left, and that means where it intersects the supply curve, the supply of credit is going to be at a lower quantity, and if the quantity is lower, that's just the quantity of money is going to be constrained. So confidence is a very important thing, and that's a big factor, I think, in the United States, for example, right now. You mentioned trade. The trade wars are really hitting confidence, and you have a situation in the United States where it just isn't a trade wars. You have what I call regime uncertainty that's factored into the picture. And the regime uncertainty isn't one particular kind of uncertainty or even a little group of uncertainties. It's the uncertainty associated with the whole regime changing. The rules of the game are changing. The whole thing is changing. And when that happens, what happens with investors? They sit on their hands. They don't know what's going to be the next move. They don't know what government policies will be affecting their potential free cash flow on new investments that they're making, and so they just don't make the investment. Now we had that, by the way, in the New Deal in the United States in the 1930s. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president, and when he came in, the New Dealers started changing everything. It's a little bit like what Trump's doing now. So you had regime uncertainty, and as a result of that, the lack of confidence was huge, and investment just stopped in 1929. So you had two things going on that make my point, and that is that you had a huge decline in the money supply in the United States, massive decline in the money supply. So that was one thing that started the Great Depression. Then you had the Smoot-Hawley tariffs and all this regime change and regime uncertainty that was going on, and that piled on the huge reduction in the money supply and made the Great Depression a lot worse, and it lasted a lot longer than would have been the case if we hadn't had regime uncertainty. And if confidence somehow would have not been so crushed as it was. The regime uncertainty crushes confidence. It doesn't improve it, it crushes it. And once you lose confidence, of course, you got a big problem on your hands, because, as you say, among other things, the demand for credit will dry up.
Can I ask you
even if the
about?
banks have the capacity to produce money, they won't, because no one will be there to demand it.
Yeah, right. I think that's a really valuable comparison. The 1930s, Roosevelt, Smoot-Hawley tariffs, Great Depression, and regime uncertainty, as you put it. But let me ask you, how important, so short-term regime uncertainty depletes consumer confidence, firm confidence, decreases appetite for borrowing and economic activity. But is that useful pain in the long term? Like, did America come out stronger as a consequence of how deep those cuts were in the 30s, how bad the Depression got? Maybe it was amplified by the tariff strategy, by some of the regime uncertainty. But on the other side of that, was it worth it? And I'd love to know your answer there and understand that better, and then see if we can pull those lessons forward to today and find any similarities.
Clearly, there were no short term, that's for sure. And I think there were no long term. A lot of bad ideas were put into the system. And one general bad idea is that somehow you could fine tune your way out of recessions. You could smooth the roller coaster ride and things like that. So it brought in fine tuning and a lot of government intervention. The rationale for it came from the New Deal, but the New Deal, it was false advertising, because the New Deal actually made everything worse. So in fact, the New Deal came in, it threw out classical economics, it threw out the old religion, and that was a bad long-term thing, not a good. So I think nothing good came out of it.
Could I ask you to expand on that a little bit? What was the major seismic shifts brought in by the New Deal? How did they change the game? And what was the lasting consequence?
Well, the lasting thing is what's called the ratchet effect. And they put in a lot of new bureaus, a lot of new agencies, a lot of new government programs, and the ratchet. Now the rationale for many of those things is gone, but the bureaus and agencies and bureaucrats, they're not gone.
No, they're definitely not. What's
So
the ratchet?
The problem is with the government. Once you start a new program, Even if there's some rationale at the time, once that rationale leaves, it's like a hydra. It just a new rationale comes up to support the thing, and it never goes away.
Right.
So we have a lot of the government that we have now. The elements of that were actually put in place by the New Dealers with Roosevelt. When Roosevelt left, everything stayed there,
Right.
and has been more or less accepted on. Remember, on a bipartisan basis. The Republicans were supposed to be embracing the old time religion, but they lost the battle.
So if I were to simplify that a little bit, you could say the end result of the New Deal and the actions taken during the Great Depression, trade strategies, export restrictions, whatever, was increased precedent for government intervention, increased bureaucracy to facilitate that, and therefore just a general decrease in free market capitalism that we've then carried forward to today. More government control, less free market capitalism. Is that it? If I were to massively simplify this?
Yeah, I think that's a good summary, and that pretty much is when it really happened. The Great Depression, remember, ended up because of the Smoot-Hawley tariff in particular. It was international.
Mm-hmm.
So it was happening every place. And
okay.
Prior to that, remember, we're talking about this is the as they call the interwar period after the First World War and before the Second World War. That's when all the madness started. So you not only had the New Deal, but also you had the military. Military is really bad.
Like the increase in military expense.
Huge increase in the military and military involvement. And if you look at the budget that is being argued, and now it's been passed by the Senate and it's over with the House today, there's a huge increase in defense expenditures. Over the next 10 years, there'll be $150 billion in increase in defense expenditures in the United States. And the money's going to the Department of Defense, which is so screwed up, they can't even audit the thing. They can't even do a phony audit. Every department of the U.S. government, an agency and bureau, it has been audited. But they can't do the Department of Defense. They try over and over again, but it's virtually been impossible to do. So that money is essentially going down the rat hole. And to give you some idea, it's over $1 trillion going to the Department of Defense. And that's where a huge amount of the waste, fraud, and abuse is. And their procurement, here's how they procure goods and services. They do it on a cost plus basis, a lot of these contracts. So if Hanke's coming in there or Jay's coming in there with something that we want to sell to the Defense Department, you phony up a cost number and you say, well, that's going to cost me $1,000. Or remember the famous $600 toilet seats years ago that they were buying at the Defense Department. So whoever was manufacturing toilet seats, they came in and said, well, it's costing us, $550 and we've got to make a little profit. So the cost plus is $600. And some idiot, some military guy signed on, some general signed for that.
Yeah.
So,
I mean,
that's what's going on. It's the 1-2 punch, going back to the historical thing, just to keep things in perspective, was the First World War, militarization, and then the Great Depression came right after that, shortly thereafter, and then the machinery of government really revved up, and all kinds of new things were added and augmented.
A couple thoughts on that. First of all, the $600 toilet seat example, you could chalk that up to a general just being a bit, I don't know, aloof. I tend to think people are smarter than that. And there's probably some other game at play there. That money's going somewhere for some cause. And maybe that happens a lot. And maybe that's why we can't audit the DOD. And, when Doge was first announced and making headlines and digging into everything in the White House and finding all of these frivolous expenses like funding DEI initiatives in Angola and all this weird stuff. But once they pointed their attention to something serious, meaning the Department of Defense, and they started making announcements, next, we're going to look at the Department of Defense. It was like 2 weeks later, all of a sudden, Elon's back to Austin to work on Tesla. Headlines really decreased in volume, and it kind of went silent, right? Now, what happened when they turned their attention to the DOD? I don't know. Why can't we audit the DOD? There's going to be an answer to that question. What's your take, Steve? Why can't the DOD pass an audit, even a phony audit? Why would you say the reason for that is?
Well, number one, DOD it is big, so to do an audit it is a big job. That's one thing, but have a tremendous number of complexities involved, secrecy and all kinds of things like that. I know one of my colleagues, by the way, William A. Niskanen. I've worked with Bill. He's no longer with us, unfortunately. A great economist, great guy, great friend. So Niskanen, and I started working with him in 1971. So I've had many iterations of working with Bill. So he was one of McNamara's whiz kids at the Defense Department when McNamara was the Secretary of Defense. And he was a whiz kid. He had a civilian appointment, but he was 27 years of age, and his rank was lieutenant general equivalent. So he was seeing everything. And when we went to the moon the first time, he'd seen so much secret stuff. He's actually written about this. His knee-jerk reaction was, oh, the whole thing had been staged in a warehouse in Washington, D.C. He actually didn't believe it for a while. So the point being, there's so much secrecy and things that are either not told or lies that are told to us. Right now, by the way, there's a big debate about this bunker busting bombs that went into Iran. Mm-hmm. We had a briefing by the Secretary of Defense and slew of generals, et cetera, that it wiped everything out. Trump said it wiped everything out, but some of the big experts, including professors at MIT, said, we haven't had any boots on the ground to inspect, but they think, just from a theoretical point of view, that it would be very doubtful that too much damage was done. So that I think that anyone who believes things coming out of the U.S. Department of Defense would have to be somebody who believed in the tooth fairy.
Okay, yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's really interesting that this fellow Bill's genuinely immediate response to the moon landing was that, obviously this is another one of the games we're playing, right? He staged in a Washington.
Yeah, he thought he genuinely thought it was a fake, and he's written about this.
And why would he think that? He would think that because of all the other decoys and fakes that exist.
Yeah, because at the very highest level, he knew what the flow of information was, and he knew there's what's called it's the same thing that happened in the Soviet Union, by the way. They with their economic data in the Soviet Union, there was what they used to call a lie factor. So if they said they produced 100 of something, well, maybe there was a 50% lie factor in there, and maybe they only produced 50, not 100. So the lie factor is very pervasive in the Department of Defense. And they get by with it. You say, well, how can this happen? Because, all these bureaus and agencies try to spin things. Let's be diplomatic. We don't call it a lie. We'll call it spinning. We won't even call it propaganda. We'll just call it spin. So they're all spinning and trying to put a good face on whatever it is they're doing.
Yeah.
But the Department of Defense, they have the ultimate defense because they say it's national security.
Sure. Yeah.
It's confidential. Once you wrap the flag around anything, any proposition, you all logical argument, all factual arguments, they disappear because it's national security. So you can't touch it.
And sometimes I imagine that's very authentic and accurate and important. You know what I sometimes wonder, Steve, is, it's easy to sit back and criticize or question the decisions at the top, and we definitely should as often as possible. Simultaneously, I run a business and I make decisions based on usually 5-year time horizons. That's what I'm planning for. My sales team thinks in quarterly time horizons. My admin staff thinks about this week, right? And so the things that I'm doing from a strategy level often don't make sense to my sales team, and definitely my admin team sometimes questions why what I think is important is actually important. But that's because we're operating with different time horizons and we're seeing things differently. We have very different levels of risk invested in this, obviously. And so there's always going to be a misalignment, and it's really tough it can be really tough to communicate that all the way down to the bottom. I think in a small business, it's actually quite easy. You should be preaching the vision and the strategy and justifying your decisions on a regular basis. But the bigger the organization gets, the more complex that is. And the US government's the largest employer in the world, isn't it? This is as big as an organization has ever been. And how much of that you think is just there's such a distance between the important high level 10-year strategy and what we can unveil today? You're never gonna. Do you understand what I'm saying? What's your take on that? There's
a fundamental difference. So you're running a private business, and whether the private business is big or small, you eventually have to get things lined up. So you face the bottom line at the end of the year, and there better be a profit in there. And if there's a loss year after year, you're going to be out. That's the end of you. So it's survival of the fittest. You have to produce what consumers want to purchase of your product or service or whatever it happens to be, and you have to do it in an efficient way. And if you don't, you're not going to make a profit, and you're going to be out of there. That is not the case with the government. The government employees do not face any kind of profit and loss statement, and forget about balance sheets. We said the Department of Defense, they don't even know where all the planes and boats and things are. It's forget the balance sheet.
Right.
It's not there. That's why they can't do an audit. By the way, in simple terms, that's why they can't do an audit, because there is no consolidated balance sheet. So how can you audit something without a balance sheet?
Right.
The other thing is that they don't face, in the private sector. The private sector is a profit and loss system. That is not the case with government. What general faces the bottom line, profit and loss? And in fact, most of the generals, once you get up in the high command, they jump to the tune of the lobbyists, because as soon as they retire on a fat pension, they will be going, most of them, into the private sector, and they'll be working for the lobbyists who've been lobbying them for years. So it's a revolving door kind of deal, because a general can retire at a relatively young age and be in good shape and, have another career.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So thank you for that. And I want to pull some of our conversation about the 30s now into today, because we're experiencing another season of regime change, as I think you put it. I'd love you to paint that picture for me a little bit. So What's the regime we're coming out of? What is the regime we're heading into? How would you describe that?
There'll be lots of changes of things that are for example, one change that looks like it's going to occur is that the U.S. Agency for International Development, that has been around since Kennedy was president, that's going to bite the dust. So there'll be a few things like this. Very unusual, by the way, to have a bureau or agency eliminated. Remember what I told you about the ratchet effect. Once you get things ratcheted in, they stay. Yeah. This is kind of an exception. So that's one thing. There'll be lots of regulations changed and so forth. But the main thing, if you look at the budget, which is the thing that really counts with the government, nothing is going to change very much, except it gets bigger. If you look at the newspapers today, after the Senate passed the Senate version of the big beautiful bill, let's look at the rhetoric and reality. The rhetoric today in the newspaper, they talk about taxes. And the narrative in the paper is a lot of screaming about tax cuts, but the reality is the bill, the taxes are more or less the status quo. They're a continuation of what we actually have. So there you get something that's off base. Government spending, the total government spending. I looked through the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, and New York Times this morning, and I must say I didn't read every single word, but I couldn't find any statement about what the total number was going to be of government spending. They're off with the narrative about this program and that program and so forth, but nobody ever got down to the bottom line, and the bottom line is everything is going up. If you look at defense is going up, veterans expenditures going up, Medicare is going up, Social Security is going up, net interest expenses going up, all the sacred cows, if you put them in a bucket, they're all going up, and Medicaid is going up. Everything across the board is going up, but you don't see that in the papers. In other words, the theme of increased government spending is not in the narrative in the newspaper at all. So there's nothing about the total. What you do find a lot of discussion about is a budget deficit. Lots of comment about that. A lot of hand-wringing about that. And the Democrats say, well, you have to increase taxes to reduce the deficit. The deficit's bad, and you have to reduce taxes. The Republicans say, well, the deficit's bad, but don't worry about it because we're changing all the regime and everything, and we'll grow faster. And the deficit won't be as big. But the calculations are, and this gets back to your thing about confidence, if you have a big deficit like this, over 6% of GDP, very big, that is a negative factor affecting confidence. And so normally if you have an increased deficit, what happens? In Keynesian economics that you're taught in Principles of Economics, if you increase the deficit, that gooses the economy because you have a positive Keynesian multiplier that you apply to whatever the deficit increase is, and the thing booms. The problem is, in the real world, not with the economic exercises in the textbooks, you find that deficits, once they get very large, like as a percent of GDP, like we're going to have and continue to have in the United States, that affects confidence in a negative way, and the multipliers are actually negative. So if you increase the deficit, it slows you down. It's a drag. It's not a stimulant. It's a drag. So that's my take on what's going to probably happen. You're not going to see a big spurt in growth. Actually, the deficit might end up on balance slowing things down a little bit. So that's one thing. that's important. The other thing is that the deficit numbers that are being produced by the bipartisan Congressional Budget Office, they have a model, of course, like all economic models, but you have to look at what they're putting into the model to get these assumptions about what's going to happen in 10 years, 20, 30 years with the budget. And here's what they have. They have plugged in there a lot of rosy assumptions that actually make the deficit a lot smaller than it would be if you didn't have those rosy assumptions. One of the rosy assumptions is that they assume we're not going to have any recessions in the next 30 years. Now, in the last 30 years, we've had 3 recessions. They also assume we'll have perpetual full employment with only unemployment rate of 4%. That's blowing smoke. I mean, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
They also assume that inflation is going to hit 2% always for 30 years. But in the last 30 years, 17 of those years, we've had inflation higher than 2%. And the last thing, they assume that bond yields, and this gets into interest on the debt, will be 3.6%. Well, the 10-year bond right now in the United States is about 4.3. So the 10-year is quite a bit higher than that right now. So you've got a lot of rosy assumptions plugged into the model, giving you all these big numbers. So if you plug more realistic assumptions in, my point is you'd get a lot bigger deficit and debt numbers.
It occurs to me that anybody who's thinking critically about this bill, the way you've kind of just laid it out for us, doesn't agree with any of the narratives and the presentation of the impact, right? There's a lot of really sort of faulty arguments and generous assumptions that are being made that probably aren't going to materialize. And that's just gaslighting the public into thinking this is something that it isn't, right? We're sort of back to that.
Absolutely. It's a lot more government expenditure. That's one thing, and that's the top line that drives everything. Why do you think the budget deficit's bigger? It's a driver on top of the thing. The top line number is government expenditures. But my point is, you couldn't even find the number in the newspaper this morning.
Right.
You couldn't find any place to say, the last fiscal year budget was A, and next year's fiscal budget under this bill is going to be B. Now that's that's basic stuff for most people. All you find was a flurry of detail about what they were going to do to Medicaid, or who was going to benefit from continuing the tax structure that we have, and so forth and so on.
I mean, I tend to just think that there's more of a, why aren't we hearing that number? Well, it's because that number is not up for debate. It's not going to change. There's no other path forward that the government's going to take. And I would also maybe make the claim that the collusion between government and media is strong enough that that's not the data point we're going to put forward. And that's why we don't hear about it. And
I think that's one aspect, Jay, but the other aspect is that all the waste, fraud, and abuse in government programs, people don't realize somebody somewhere benefits from that. Even the waste, fraud, and abuse. People, they say, well, why is it so difficult to get rid of? It's difficult to get rid of it because people benefit from it.
Yeah.
Why do you think Elon Musk and Doge, when they went in and identified things where they indicated there was waste, fraud, and abuse, they could cut almost nothing because there were people benefiting from it.
Mm-hmm. One of my guests, Colonel Douglas McGregor, makes the argument that Washington is donor-occupied territory. And that's why, despite how you and I may feel as voters, the impact is nil, because at the end of the day, democracy has been upgraded to the donor class. And that's who really pushes policy forward and has the leverage, can prevent change if they enjoy the status quo. As you just mentioned, there's beneficiaries of the waste, fraud, and abuse, right? Somebody's making $550 on that $600 toilet seat cover. Like that's happening, right? And
Yeah.
so if you're enjoying the status quo, you're going to lobby for that to continue. And there's tremendous money behind that. Both bipartisan, both directions.
Yeah. It's totally a bipartisan thing. And if you look at the budget and the quibbling over the budget, the thing is over 900 pages long. What person in the U.S. Congress is paying attention to that? Well,
Yeah, totally.
forget it. It's they're not paying attention to it. Excuse me just a second.
Yeah.
They're not paying attention to it. But they are paying attention to what's on page 824. Somebody is, because there's some deal in there for some lobbyist or some special interest group that has a lot of senators and congressmen that have been paid off, basically, and they're paying a lot of attention to that page.
Their page.
So,
Their page.
So
right?
not the whole picture and what's really going on with it and the top line number. No one cares about that. They care about all the little details involved with the budget, because all those little details ultimately end up with a special interest group behind them one way or another.
Right.
Somebody is either wanting more subsidies and more freebies or worried about getting their subsidy taken away. For example, we did get, speaking of subsidies, we got an end of President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act component of subsidies for wind and solar power. But then on the other hand, another Biden era act, CHIPS Act, the CHIPS Act, actually the subsidies for semiconductor construction of plants that produce semiconductors, that actually went up.
Right. So
it's
there's 900 pages, but I'm only looking at my page, right? As long as my page is in there, I don't care what else is in there, right?
Right.
Get
exactly.
my page approved, we're good.
And you're going to defend whatever you're defending with tooth and nail.
Yeah, self-interest prevails. I mean, isn't that the bones of free market capitalism to a degree? It's hard, right? Because the lines blur a little bit.
Well, in a way they blur, but it's a difference. The revenue coming out of the government, that comes out of somebody's taxes. That's how revenue is produced. In the private sector, revenue is produced by selling somebody something they want.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, there are people who want the subsidies, but who finances it? Taxpayers.
Yeah, you and me. Yeah. Oh, and I get the difference. I just mean from the individual standpoint, that individual who's arguing for their page to be included.
Oh yeah. In that sense, it's economics 101. Economics is all about incentives. So
yes, that's what I mean.
If you want to get on the gravy train and think you have a good chance of getting on the gravy train, you expend a lot of effort, a lot of expenses, and a lot of lobbying and so forth to what? Get on the gravy train and basically have a high rate of return on the gravy.
Yeah, exactly. Which is what we're all seeking. And I think we have different moral compasses, which is really important. And I don't know that you ever get away from, because it strikes me that the more ambitious you are as an individual, generally the more self-interested you are as well. And the more ruthless you're willing to be making concessions to your virtues or morals, right? And you can see this in the corporate world for sure. People that aren't likely to have uncomfortable conversations or confrontations or don't want conflict, they kind of hit a ceiling early in their career. They're not going to go too much higher than where they're at because they're not willing to have the uncomfortable conversations that will get them there. But those that are comfortable with conflict and willing to bend a little bit when necessary, rise a bit further. And I'm not saying it's bad. It's just, the world's complex and it's hard to navigate. And, the top rungs of politics, you're going to find those that are probably most flexible with their virtues and most self-interested at the same time.
Oh, everybody's making on a personal level benefit cost calculations. And some people, if you present them with an option, they say, for me, the benefits aren't worth the cost. I'm not going to do it. and some other guy or gal, they say, oh, the benefits to me are for that option are very much greater than the cost. I'm going for it. So it's all individual calculus. There's no question about that. But and all driven by incentives. But the subjective valuation of the benefits and costs are different with each individual because individuals have different subjective values.
Yes, 100%. Steve, this has been a really enlightening and interesting conversation. I really appreciate your time. And I think the subject matter is very, very important. And I encourage everybody to pick up a copy of Making Money Work. This is Professor Hanke's newest book. We'll put a link right beneath this video for easy access. Go get yourself a copy. Thank you so much for your time, Professor. I appreciate it.
You're welcome, Jay. Great to be with you again. Have a great day.
Yeah, you too. You too.
Most investors think they're playing it safe, following mainstream advice, chasing trends, and clinging to the herd mentality. But there is nothing safe about mainstream advice. The smartest investors know that real wins come from thinking independently and spotting opportunities long before the crowd. And that's what we teach at the Commodity University. This is an exclusive membership designed to arm you with the skills from the sharpest minds in the mining investment world. Each of our professionals has a proven track record of finding trends before anyone else. At the Commodity University, you'll gain access to a highly curated and growing catalog of courses covering what you actually need to know to become an informed commodity investor. Every single month, you'll receive a brand new course packed with insights from the best in the business, giving you the edge to stay ahead. If you're tired of following the crowd and ready to invest smarter, think sharper, and understand the mining industry like the professionals, then take the next step and join the Commodity University today.